Hi, Jeremy Crow here. In this video, I wanted to go over what happens when you die. First off, I have to say this, that nobody knows what happens when you die. Even if people have clinically been declared dead and then come back, in one sense, you could technically say they know what happens when you die, but that's just the legal definition of death. I'm talking about when you're actually dead, like if you go back far enough, like even if you go back I don't know, like just to be safe, you could say 100 years. 100 years back, if somebody were to have a heart attack and fall dead in the street, and you went and started giving them CPR, basically you'd be arrested for molesting a corpse. Because they thought, if you had a heart attack and you drop dead, you're dead. They didn't realize back then that there were some things you could do that would actually be able to revive the individual, and then they'd be totally alive and they wouldn't be dead, so and even if you go back further, they used to have like a bell that with a string, so when they would bury somebody, if that person woke up or whatever, came out of the coma or whatever that they were in, that the people thought they were dead, they could they could pull on the cord and they'd be like, oh shit. They think I'm dead, shit, and they'd be ringing the bell like crazy, and somebody like somebody who was watching the graveyard, the security or whatever, would hear the bell ringing, and they would be like, oh shit, there's somebody, that person's not actually dead, and they would get people to help them dig them up. And so the definition of death keeps getting pushed further and further. So I'm not talking about what we currently have set as the legal definition of death, because there are people that know what happens, or there are people that have gone through the experience of being legally declared dead, and they're not dead, they're alive, and so they know what happened. They've experienced that, but that's different. That's not what I'm talking about, and I think most of you understand the distinction. I'm going to base this off of alchemy, essentially. So in one of the most famous alchemical texts, the Emerald Tablet, there's a hermetic axiom listed there, and it's that which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above, for the performance of the miracles of the one true thing. And often it gets just shortened down into as above, so below. And that's where that comes from. And essentially what it means is that you can learn something about other planes of existence by comparing it to how things behave on other planes. So you can learn something about the waking world by examining your dreams, your dreaming world, and vice versa. You can learn something about your dream realm or world or whatever, your internal world, by examining the material world, and so on. The subtle planes have reflections on the more dense planes, and vice versa. So there's kind of like a resonance, or like something like that. It's not identical, but it can inform you on that other thing. So what happened, like, let's just take a look at the physical plane. Obviously, like, we have science that can really dig down deep into the specific details and what is actually going on like a molecular level on the physical plane. So we have that level of knowledge on that physical plane. So let's start there. So essentially, like if you want to just summarize what happens when you die, when your physical body stops working, essentially the bonds between the various different components that make up the body, you know, the organs, the cells, you know, these bonds between the various different components start breaking down. And eventually all of the parts of the body break down and go off to make other bodies. You end up, the classic feeding the worms and pushing up the daisies, right? Like those components that make up the body, after they get broken down, they get reused by other things to make other bodies. So I kind of think that, one thing that might happen on the more subtle planes when you die is that the soul, or the just to define the terms here, I use a tripartite division of man, the body, the soul, and the spirit. These are the three essential main categories you could put the components of an individual in. So the body, obviously the physical stuff. The soul, now that is your personal kind of, your memories, your predilections, your personalities, plural. This is the, what makes you, what makes you unique in the world, and not just what, the physical uniqueness, but more, that has an influence. There's like a bit of overlap there, right? But I'm talking about more like you, the soul of the individual. And then spirit I use as kind of like the spark, the transpersonal spark of life that's in all of us. So the soul. What happens to the soul when the body stops working? Well, presumably it goes through a similar process of decomposition. The various different parts of the soul. And you know what? We're pretty divided. We have a lot of different personality aspects, some of which conflict with one another. How often have you felt divided internally? You want this, but you also want the opposite, how many times have you were like, well, maybe I should do this, or maybe I shouldn't, and part of me wants to do this, but the other part of me says no. We're very divided. So the various different components of the soul, the bonds between them, the things holding them kind of together, we're a loose composition, we're a loose collection of these components, right? So the bonds between these components start to break down, and then those components go on to get used to make other souls, and so you may find yourself inheriting soul parts from other people. Now, the thing is, if you study alchemy, you understand that the quintessence, the most famous example of which would be the Philosopher's Stone, a quintessence is when you've taken the base substance, the starting material, broken it down, and purified each part separately, individually, and then recombine those purified parts together, which then bond so strongly that they cannot be broken apart again. Now, perhaps it's possible to do that process, of that alchemical process, put your own soul through that alchemical process to the point where there's the bonds between the components, it's like there is no bonds, or there is no bonds between components anymore, because it's a unified whole. You've managed to forge a unified soul out of the disparate parts that you've inherited or picked up along the way. And then perhaps at death, you know, when your body stops, where your physical body stops working, perhaps the soul resists that breaking down, that fermentation or putrefaction, because you've already done it while you're alive. You've already gone through that process of putrefaction of the soul, breaking it down into its component parts, going through each part, purifying it, and then integrating it into the whole in such a profound state of internal harmony and union that it will not break apart again. And that could be a form of immortality, literal immortality of the soul. Now, this version of that concept of immortality of the soul, it's not automatic. You know, there's no automatic immortality of the soul. You have to earn it. You have to forge that immortal soul, that unified soul unit, you know, that's gonna survive the second death, some people call it, which is a term from Christian mysticism. You hear mention in the Bible about the second death, and some people will survive the second death and some people won't. So that's interesting. I think that you could use that to describe that process of the soul breaking down, or resisting that breaking down. You know, that's, you know, surviving the second death or avoiding the second death in a sense. Now, the other thing, though, the other aspect to this whole equation is that it's not the same exactly. The concepts inform one another from the different planes, from the subtle to the gross, you know. The difference is that on the physical plane, unless you get down to the quantum level, but generally on the plane that we experience on the macro level, you can't exactly copy your physical, you know, an atom is an atom, you know, a chunk of matter is a chunk of matter. You can't you know, if you wanted to transfer it to another individual, you have to give it to them, you know. If you wanted to give somebody a piece of your liver, you know, you would have to get a transplant. You could give somebody one of your kidneys, you know, but you would have to take it out of your body, physically remove it, and then have it physically installed into their body. Now, the difference, though, is on the soul level, on the level of soul, it's non-physical. And like, you could compare it to software in the sense that you can copy it infinite times. So, you know, a soul fragment, you know, a component of the soul, an aspect of the soul, a soul fragment is the preferred term that I like to use, can be copied infinitely, you know, and you don't have to be dead, you know. So the thing is, you can copy soul fragments onto other individuals. You can take copies of soul fragments from other individuals and add them to your collection of soul fragments that you are composed of. You know, it's arguable that reading a book copies someone else's soul fragment into your soul fragment collection bag, or whatever you want to call it, you know. That, you know, actually you watching this video is kind of me copying a soul fragment from myself into your psyche, in a sense. And so that's another thing that happens, so it's different in that you can, to have a soul fragment go on to make other souls, you don't have to die for that to happen. It's not the same level of like cause effect time sequence kind of thing. You could copy elements or aspects of your soul fragments onto other people left, right, and center all day long. And you can do it by, say, publishing a book, and then for centuries, even thousands of years potentially after you're dead, as long as that book survives, then you could continue copying parts of your soul onto other individuals and having a persistent influence in the world through parts of your soul still existing in the world and having a physical body that it's acting through. So, it gets a little different, one of the things that you can do is you can try and build a legacy where you have kind of a system set up where your soul fragments are being preserved in various ways. Now, this is kind of like the idea from Harry Potter of a Horcrux, or whatever the word is, Horcrux or whatever, right? Where he kind of splits his soul into pieces and hides them into various different objects, one of which is a book, and these are items that are very personal to him, it seems, Voldemort. And so, if you were to write a book, then you would essentially be creating a Horcrux in a sense, right? If you look at it from that perspective. And so, on the one hand, you can develop a legacy where you will establish a persistent influence in the world that will continue long after you're dead, potentially. That's one form of immortality that you can seek to attain. Another form is, like I said, if you were to go through the alchemical process, if you were to bring your soul through that alchemical process while you're still alive, then it wouldn't break down, or maybe large chunks of it would survive, at least if you didn't complete the process fully. Maybe large chunks of your soul would stay intact, and would go on to make other souls, perhaps continue to exist and interact on a subtle plane. This is an idea for what might happen when you die. One that I find inspiring because of the way that it kind of helps guide the things you're going to do in your life. But also it just seems to make the most sense to me based off of the whole Hermetic axiom of as above, so below, if that is even genuine, which to me, it seems to be. It's not an absolute kind of principle of the universe kind of thing necessarily, but it is something that I do feel is valuable for gaining insight when you use it to contemplate the various aspects of the multiverse. So what do you think? What do you think happens when you die? I'd like to hear about it. And what did you think about the scenario that I put forward? Do you think that has any merit? I'd like to hear your opinions on all this. Thanks.